We are here in Łódź, 30th International Comic Book Festival, and we're speaking with John Higgins. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. Hello.
How are you so far?
I'm really enjoying it. I'm very surprised how bright it's suddenly become today compared to we arrived on Wednesday, and for 2-3 days it rained non-stop. But what a beautiful city it is.
Oh yeah, now it's pretty nice, the weather. Is it your first staying in Poland?
Yes, I've been very, very lucky. So I've been travelled all around the world because there's so many people who appreciate what I appreciate, which is good comics.
Oh.
So we are invited to so many different places around the world. But I don't think I've been to Poland before, and definitely never been to Łódź before. So I'm really enjoying it.
Well, I hope you will enjoy it for the next few days, and I would like to ask you a few questions about your whole career in the comic book industry. But when I was researching your history with art, comic books, I read on your Wikipedia page that you were working as a medical illustrator in 1975, and I was wondering, at that point, were you interested in making comic books? Were you interested in comic books, or did it came later?
When I went to art college, I was I rediscovered comics due to fellow students, but I never really thought I could make a living doing it. And I can look back 40 years and say, funnily enough, I can make a living doing it. I became a medical artist because I loved anatomy. I loved the fact that, one, it could be educational, and certainly the hospitals I was working at, they needed illustrators to be able to make something in a form that could be published for new doctors, nurses, surgeons. So I wanted to go into the educational and storytelling aspect, should we say. I mean, I love the fact that you can make it into a story. Education, you can make that into a story through comics format if you wanted. But not in the early days. I loved comics and I was a comics fan, but I never really thought I would actually be able to get into the business.
I guess there is centrally a difference between working with bi-monthly comic book and making those medical illustrations. There are, I think you can say that there are different deadlines. It's not so strict, I think. How was it in that kind of matter?
I think the great thing about art college, as much as anything for people, is the fact that depending if you know where you're going to go, if you don't know where you're going to go educationally, and I did know I wanted to be a medical artist. But other than that, it also gives you a lot of time to develop a style or something practice. It's the simplest thing almost. When comics fans come up to me and ask me how they want to get into the business, they want to be writers or artists. And I know writers say exactly the same thing, and it's basically practice. You read or visually look at something that impresses you, and then it's you just constantly try and learn and discover new things about it. And one of the things from the early days that you find once you leave our college, there's always someone else's schedule. You're always working for someone else's schedule. So even in the medical field, we had to produce so much and turn it round for the doctors and the surgeons to be published, because that was the whole reason we were there. We had to depict operations and post-mortems and things like that, which was a really interesting thing for a 20-year-old guy to do, sort of thing. But then when you discover publishing to a schedule, when you got into comics publishing, then the grind of producing work day in, day out, it could really take you to the edge of creativity, but also frustration. I was never the best artist at school, but I'm out of a lot of the people that went to our college with me. There's only probably about, out of 30, should we say, there's probably only about 3 who's actually made a career out of it, either as a designer or as an artist. So you have to have multiple things. You have to have a discipline to be a comic artist. You have to be able to get up, make yourself get up every single day to produce the work. And then the publishers dictate the schedule. So it can be a grind. It's probably almost as much a grind as like doing shows to be promoted on the internet or any medium.
I was wondering, you mentioned that you were a fan of comics earlier in your life. What kind of comic books you were reading? What kind of books you have? Well, I guess in daily reading at home.
For me, so like the comics that you got in the newsagents and bookstores, or like mainstream bookstores, weren't, except for the odd exception, weren't particularly interesting because they had a particular format and style, and you had to like either have, if it was Batman, so like, you know, it tended to be the Joker ad infinitum nauseum. You know, he kept coming back week after week, month after month, year after year, and that can get quite tiresome, you know, unless it's done in a way that Alan Moore introduced people into like storytelling in the mid-80s, which is a very long, long way away from when I went to art college. So the mainstream comics really didn't interest me, and you might know as well that sort of like America had a censorship code.
Yeah.
You know, they censored things in American comics that they would not be allowed to be produced, and obviously it was like Hollywood, I suppose, in a way. You know, it was dictated to, censored by outside sources and people who did not necessarily care about the object, you know, the story or the art. So yes, basically the mainstream comics were very, very boring. So the sort of comics that I really enjoyed were the underground press, the small press, and I still have a huge admiration and affinity for small publishers. You know, people who are doing local artists in Poland, you know, or anywhere else in the world. I love seeing art that has been produced by local artists and published locally. The behemoth that I work for, DC Comics, you know, they produce work that's published all around the world, which is great for me. And mainly because it's great for me because it is quality stuff and it deserves to be seen by world readership. But when I see small press and when I see stories told that are relevant to, like, you know, whatever storytelling elements, it might be horror, it might be political, it might be science fiction, or it might be like aliens with beards, or anything as interesting as that. So it sometimes you get a sense of national identity, should we say. But yeah, I love small press, and that started from when I first got into comics. And even those like the underground press, when I was first at college, tended to be predominantly American, yet again. They were trying to do stuff that was different, and they used artists from all over the world, which is an incentive for me, and it's probably put a germ of an idea into my brain that maybe one day I could work in comics.
Well, you can say that with small press, with independent comic books, the artists, without having publishers and editors somewhere behind their job, well, they basically creating stuff straight from their heart. And I think it's, do you think also that way, that it just, well, it's 100% you, not somebody else, and it making it, well, more beautiful, I think, in meaning of art.
That is a brilliant point. That is a really nice point. Well done, well made as well. And you're right, because as a personal, you care. The individual artists and writers care deeply about what they're producing. And it could be anything. It could be funny. It could be like science fiction. As I said, you know, it could be anything. But because they love what they do, and I love what I do, and I'm very, very lucky that I work with a lot of collaborators who I enjoy working with, and also a lot of them I am a comics fan. So if I'm doing a Batman or like a Hellblazer or, you know, John Constantine or Judge Dredd, then I am in a fan's heaven. You know. But you're right. The personal stuff that people write about and depict, there's an energy there that I think is not dictated to by the fact that you're being paid to produce this particular job in this particular time scale. So yeah, that's a very nice point. Well done.
Well, why do you think? Because small press, independent artists, when they are at some shows like festivals, like here in Łódź, they don't necessarily gain that much interest in people mind that like mainstream comic books, like DC, Marvel stuff, etc. Do you think? Why do you think that it looks like that? People just tend to, well, they like some brands and they just are closed mind, or is it changing maybe in your opinion? Is it maybe people are more open now for more independent stuff? Well,
I think that's a good point as well, actually. I think people are more open to independent stories, publication and arts. But I think probably one of the biggest problems and it's always been the same, so like, you tend to get swamped by, the big companies. I mean, as soon as a movie comes out, they've got a 2-hour advert, so like saying, read, so like, our books, you see, this is what's appeared on the big screen, this is Captain America or Iron Man or whatever, Batman. So of course, people want to go out and buy great art and great stories by the big publishers. But when sort of like a small independent gets it right, I mean, they can get it more right than the big publishers. And that's one of the things. So a number of conventions I go to, and one of the things we do talk about, why should we work for a big company? What do we get out of that? And a lot of creators, funny enough, mainly writers for some reason, but lots of writers do have a sense of they don't want to like take the American dollar and like write yet another Batman's like Joker mashup. They want to like something that stretches them as artists, as creative people. And I think to a certain extent, because an artist has a different sort of energy and input into something, because a writer can write, 20, 30, 40 comic books a year. An artist would probably only be able to do 4 or 5 or 6, depending on just how many pages. But, so the ideas that like a writer can come up with can be, rolled out. And there's, if they have personal ideas, then to a certain extent, they can sort of like write that idea that they love and care about, give it to an artist, find the right artist, and then they can go and like work for the American dollar and like make the money that can afford them to give them time to write their personal projects. And there's a lot of people I do know who do that, and I think that's a really nice way of approaching it. Some people obviously get like the idea of being able to buy bread and put it on the table and send the kids to school. They like to be able to pay the rent, and that's why I've worked for DC and Marvel and other companies throughout the last 40 years.
Well, going back to your work, which comic book, what was the moment for you when you realized that, wow, this is it, this is my breakthrough in comic book industry, this is what I wanted to do and make money for it and feel 100% as an artist who is working with his craft in this industry? Which moment was the breakthrough personally for you?
The weird thing was, it actually literally happened, right at the beginning of my career. And it's not sort of like the best work I've ever done, or it's not the best character or whatever. But when 2000 AD first appeared in 1977, that's just before I left art college. And when I left art college, what I wanted to do was be a book illustrator, which I did for about 10 years. But I started sending work to 2000 AD, and I was looking at getting into the American undergrounds or independent press or whatever. And one of the problems is, so like, because of our industry, it's like collaboration is a really important thing to do. If you're a writer, then you have to get an artist to work in our industry. And sometimes you can work the other way around. If you're an artist, you obviously need a story, and it's like, not necessarily most artists want to write or can write. But I actually started writing stories for myself because I always loved science fiction, and I liked the horror aspect because of the undergrounds I used to read, which for me, my favourite undergrounds was by an artist called Richard Corbin, who you might know of. And he used to write his own stories, and they always had a slightly different edge and emphasis. and the combination of the art and the writing seemed to be really as close as you could possibly imagine it to be. So I wrote just a one-off for 2000 AD, and I think it was only 2.5 pages or 3 pages, because I actually couldn't write much more of a story than that. But it actually had a beginning, middle, and an end. And then when, one, they liked the story, and two, they liked the artwork and published it, that for me made me think, hang on, this is a way I can actually start generating income. And in some ways, because I was in control of everything, the writing and the illustration, the only thing I didn't do was the lettering. It was just the light bulb moment going on. And literally it did start from that point onwards, and I started seriously looking at trying to make a living in comics, to make a career out of comics.
I'm aware that probably a lot of people ask you about that, but I would like to go to the topic of the Killing Joke comic book. There were some, let's say, controversy because of the first version of the book, when you were a colorist, when Brian Bolland had something else in his vision. I just wanted to ask you how exactly your work process on that book looked like, and did you have any strict, let's say, instructions how it should look, or you had more like free hand in that project?
I think I was actually very, very lucky to be in the right place at the right time, and I think that's probably a fact of life in any industry. I mean, if it's more than just a 9-to-5 job, if it's in the creative industries, like if you're an actor, an interviewer, publisher, artist, whatever sort of thing, if you get the timing right, then things fall into place, or can fall into place if you have the talent and the timing and the ability. And so, because I just finished Watchmen and starting to get known in DC and America generally, they were starting to come to me with projects. And because Brian was sadly taking so long to finish his Batman story, they thought, we can't, he was just going to take forever, because it was traditionally done. We did it as a fully painted job. So I got the blue line. What they did in that particular, it's called blue lining, as opposed to just doing flat colours the way we did with Watchmen. And I'm supplied with a blue line image of Brian's black line, and then we put his black line on my colouring. So it was basically a fully painted technique, which was, it gave me freedom to do my natural style. And my natural style is very, very colourful, as opposed to Brian's very muted style. So for me, they came to me because, as I say, Brian was taking a long time, and I think it was I think Tim Burton's movies were just coming out at that particular time. So it's late 80s, early 90s.
Yeah, the movie was releasing in 1989.
Yeah.
So it was like a year difference, I think.
Yeah, so they were definitely, there was a real interest in Batman and what they were doing. Again, it goes back to the fact that they had this big, massive expose of saying, look how great this character is, we want to read the books or more books about this character. So Brian had to, in DC's opinion, get it out while the iron was hot. He had to achieve something. And the thing is, the fact that it's become a perennial bestseller, it's sold, it still sells now,
well,
hand over fist.
Yeah, I think there's top 100 trade paperbacks selling books. Killing Joke for today is in top 10, 30, something like that. To today, it is incredible.
Yeah, so but who would have known?
Yeah.
We would still be printing Watchmen and Killing Joke so many years later. So I certainly wouldn't have imagined it. But they really needed to get it out and get it out fast. I had a brief conversation with Brian. He did say he wanted his flashbacks done such and such a way, quite muted, and that's basically all I got from him. Whereas when I worked with Dave Gibbons on Watchmen, we worked very closely, and I was getting feedback constantly. Brian felt he didn't need to give me too much direction, which is fine. So I did what I'd done on Watchmen, basically. I was doing my natural palette. And the fact is, like, it subsequently turned out that he had a completely different concept in his colour concept in his mind. You know, I only found out 30 odd years later, sort of thing, when I saw it on the shelves without my name on the cover. So it was, it was interesting, and I'm really pleased now we've got both versions out there. So they're still reprinting mine, they're still reprinting Brian's, and the nice thing is we've got them in the absolute edition, so you can see both of them next to each other, which is really, really good.
I would like to ask you about how colorist job looked like in the 80s when you were working as a colorist, because nowadays there's a lot of digital work. Is basically kind of easier, I think, in some ways, but I was wondering how do the process look like in sending art to approval in that way, in the technical way?
That's an interesting story question. I mean, lots of times people, they don't ask me that. But it's really weird because, like, we take so much for granted. It's like the internet. It's like I send images to DC or whichever publisher I'm working for, and it gets to them in minutes, rather than like, you know, in the old days, you used to have to send a FedEx, you know, and if we wanted anything approved, well, they couldn't approve it because it have to be approved there. You know, they would see it, and then by the time it got to them, it might be too late to change anything anyway. So they did tend to use a lot of trust in those days. The black and white, you could, what's it called? There's fax. So the old fax machines. So you could send them black and white, but you certainly couldn't send them colour in those days. So just that aspect of it. In the old days, it was sort of like they had such a tight schedule. You know, it was a 6 weeks turnaround. You know, you had to, once it was scheduled, then you had 6 weeks to produce the artwork or the colour or whatever, and that included sending it, the physical item, to the publishers, and then it had to be edited and probably had to be lettered. So it really was like a cut-off point at every stage. And in those days also, if you like missed the print date, the printer would fine the publisher, you know, and you would lose your slot because everything was like turning. I just find it hard to believe that once, like, how many printers have gone out of business, because I know the company that we used to use was called Sparta. They used, I know Quebecor was the printers, but there used to be a town in America called Sparta, and it was a small town, and they used to employ people literally in the whole town to produce hand-set colours. But Quebecor was a French-Canadian company, and they used to print millions and millions and millions of copies of comics every year, and now they don't exist anymore.
As far as I understand from your statement, you are working digitally also in as a colorist. So, when was the first time you used computer as a your trade-off tool in your artist career, and was it a big wow technology, or it was more natural for you? How it looked for you?
I was so excited when we got the Power Max in the early days. They used to be called Power Max, 6100, 7100 Power Max. And when they started to be able to produce colour art, very similar to what I was trying to do with my fully painted colour with airbrush, because I liked very smooth, flat colours or very smooth, graduated tones. I could like separate, I could make it rough or smooth or whatever. But when the computer first appeared, it was such a liberating thing for me as a colour artist. One, I could actually make more money, which is a great thing to be freelance and make more money, because you could turn around so much faster. And I was one of the first first artists in probably world comics who was using computers in that way. It's like Dave Gibbons and Angus Mackay were the only two other people that I certainly knew who were producing colour digital comics. And so I was probably mid-90s when I first got my first computer. And I still can't believe the fact, like, when I upgraded to the next Power Mac, it cost as much as a small family car. You know, it cost something like £9,000, pounds, which would be what, 30,000 salts.
Yeah, something like
You know,
that.
so it's just ridiculous to think you spend that much. Whereas nowadays you can get everyone. You have probably more power in your mobile phone than I had in those days. But it was an eye opener. I loved it, and I was like, it's only sort of like it's actually gone full circle for me. I actually am going back to the traditional, almost. My partner, my wife, who's also an artist, if I'm doing professional comic stories, I do it traditionally, scan it into the computer, and then my wife, Sally Jane, she's like does the digital colouring. So we're a really nice team, and I just think it's quite funny because I'm probably more known for colouring, you know, like Watchmen and Killing Joke, than for any other one aspect of my career. Whereas now I'm actually employing someone to do my colouring for me, and thankfully we are connected in an emotional way as well, which is the best collaboration as far as I'm concerned.
Well, there are some group of people who read comic books and are they have strong opinions about art created in using the computer. Why do you think some people cannot accept that digital painting art is still the art, but made with other tools?
It's really weird. It's really interesting because, in fact, I would actually recommend people go to the DC exhibition that's on at the moment in Łódź. And what people will see there, they will see the old traditional original artwork from, 80 years back, sort of thing, all up to Killing Joke. Brian's got a page in there. Neil Adams, another great Batman artist. Alan Davis is a really good friend, Batman artist. And you see all this traditional black and white pages. And there's some Alex Ross, but Alex is slightly different artist, but it's all traditionally painted. And you see there's a lot of film design and artwork done, but it's all digital. So you see the original black and white mainly, and you can see the thumbprints of the artist. You can see where he's used Tipex and whiteout to change something. You can sort of like see where that black line is darker than that black line, where he's used felt tip rather than like Indian ink and so on. So there's a life to these A3 original pieces of artwork. Then you go and look at the digital artwork. The images are wonderful. The concept by the artist is exactly the same as the concept by any artist in any traditional field. Exactly the same concept for digital artists, exactly the same creativity. But there's something, it's like looking at a great photograph. It doesn't have a sense of a being, there's no original digital art because it's all original, it's all print. So it all looks like someone's photographed Krypton exploding against a red sun. It's that sort of thing. And I find it less impressive than these like A3 traditional grubby, grey, yellowing pages of white art that the artist actually touched 80 years ago. And that for me is quite moving and touching. The digital stuff, to a certain extent, visually I love it, but it leaves me cold as an entity to look at.
Okay, I understand. You're still working as an artist, and I'm always wondering, do you have any time to read comic books while working on them? Because it's very hard job with a lot of hours with the art. But do you have time to enjoy other artists' comic books at the time?
Yeah, I'm very because I've been doing it for so long. I have a very strict working regime. So I always make sure I have set breaks, and I've always had, my coffee break, my breakfast coffee break, lunch, coffee afternoon, and then I finish for the day. So I've always got a defined framework to how I'm going to work. I do tend to work 7 days a week, but that's because my wife is a workaholic as well. So when we come to wonderful conventions like this, I mean, it's such a pleasure to... This is how we socialise, it's part and parcel of my occupation, but it's also a pleasure to meet people like yourself who are enthusiasts about comics, and you're expressing to your viewers, like your enthusiasm. Hopefully my enthusiasm comes across as well. So this sort of thing, this is great. I mean, we're off for a week, and we've enjoyed Woods very, very well the last 2-3 days, and just really enjoyed it. So working in such a defined way, in such a defined schedule, gives me, I know I'll have 20 minutes for a coffee break in the morning. I spend 20 minutes looking at my latest comic book. But I'm very, very picky now, because I do tend to pick my favourite artists or my favourite writers. It tends to be my favourite artists. And I'm always influenced. And as I was saying about local press, I will be picking up some local artists, local publications, and because to see what, as you said, it's the emotional input that people are doing, that inspires me, and it makes me try harder. So that's to always see what other people are doing is an inspiration for me.
Well, you certainly have occasion to go around the world on other conventions. So did you had that opportunity to feel the difference difference in art of in different countries, how people produce their art? Do you, when you are seeing those differences, can you feel it, that there's something definitely different from mainstream comic books from States or in UK?
Yeah, I mean, it's brilliant. I mean, it's another good question. I mean, the nice thing is that I find when you see work by artists who don't have mainstream constraints, should we say, so they can experiment. They might do collage, or they might art collages, or they might do textures. They might, I don't know if you know the artist Dave McKean.
Oh yes.
Arkham Asylum and Black Orchid and so on. And when he first started, a lot of his stuff, as far as I know now, is digital, and it's still visually stunning, really interesting. But if you ever go to one of his exhibitions and see his work from 20, 30 years ago, it's textured. He would use the wing of a seagull. Obviously, he would pick detritus, it's wood and sand, and he would make an artwork in a canvas. And the canvas was I remember seeing one of his originals, and it was about 4 foot wide by 6 foot tall, and it was reduced into a Hellblazer. Was it Hellblazer that he did? No, it was Sandman, wasn't it? Yeah. And it was just reduced down to a wonderful image, but the texture, and the texture was inches deep, which is really, really interesting. So yes, that's the sort of thing, sometimes I'm very happy to see traditional, very stylish and very what I would expect to see in mainstream books, but also I am surprised by someone who will try something different by doing something that maybe taps into an East European sensibility of art, and we went to a couple of really nice art galleries the last couple of days, and seeing there's an East European sensibility, some approaching to some of the art. It's worldwide, but sometimes you see that is so specifically, wonderfully, Polish, or it has a sensibilities that you might not see elsewhere. It's like if you go to Spain, it's this warm, lush colours. If you go to other dark, Scandinavian countries, it'd be very the colours will be darker and closing in sort of thing. There's a sensibility of a national identity almost. So yeah, I mean, I'm probably going on a little bit too much because we're all influenced by international sensibilities now when it comes to art and comics in particular. But yes, I'm expecting to be surprised by what I'm going to see in Polish comics.
Last question, because we have last 2-3 minutes. What is your most favorite memory of comic books?
I think for me, the nice thing, because I have been so fortunate to be in the right place at the right time with a number of the projects I've worked on, probably for me, weirdly enough, was when I lived in America for a few years when I was working for DC in particular. And when I came back to the UK, the weird thing was I started doing I'd left Judge Dredd, I was doing a lot of American projects. And I came back to the UK and I was working on a Judge Dredd story for 2000 AD. And it was just before the Watchmen movie was to be produced and made. And I was starting to work with Dave Gibbons again, and I was starting to do colouring for his artwork for the movie. And the designs might have been slightly different, but it was still Watchmen-inspired work. And I remember sitting there thinking, I'm drawing Watchmen, and I'm drawing Judge Dredd, which basically started for me the same year, 1986, but now it's 2008, something like that. But I felt in 2008, I knew what I was going to do, whereas in 1986, it was all, what the hell am I going to do, sort of thing. So for me, actually, funny enough, it was 2008. I suddenly got a sense of, I love these characters. I've come almost full circle, yet I've got more energy now than I had. And I know, obviously, thank God I know a lot more now than I did in 1986. And it was just a revelation for me. I loved it. It was a great feeling.
Thank you for the interview. Thank you for speaking with me, and have a great time in Poland. And I hope we'll see you soon again.
I definitely hope so. I would love to be invited back, and I really enjoyed talking to you. And thank you for some of those questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.